At 4:30 in the afternoon, on an ordinary Tuesday, the ground beneath southern Japan simply stopped behaving like ground. For 11 seconds, then 20, then nearly a full minute, the earth did not shake so much as it convulsed, and in that span of time, an entire region of Kyushu Island was rewritten. Shopping malls that had stood for decades folded in on themselves. Bullet trains froze mid-journey. A chimney at a paper factory came down like a felled tree. And somewhere beneath a collapsed ceiling in a town called Kashima, dozens of people who had been walking, shopping, living ordinary lives moments earlier were suddenly buried in darkness, waiting for a rescue that would take days to complete. This is the story of the magnitude 7, one earthquake that struck Kumamoto Prefecture, and the first raw images that revealed just how much devastation it left behind. The epicenter sat roughly 20 kilometers south of Kumamoto City, a metropolitan area home to some 700,000 people, nestled on the southern main island of Kyushu. The Japan Meteorological Agency clocked the quake at magnitude 7. 1, striking at a shallow depth that maximized the violence of the shaking at the surface. The United States Geological Survey, using its own global network of sensors, measured it slightly lower at 6, 8, but in the moments after the quake, magnitude numbers meant nothing to the people on the ground. What mattered was that Japan's seismic intensity scale, the Shindo scale, registered the highest possible reading in the affected zone. A 7, the maximum. The kind of shaking that does not simply rattle dishes from shelves, it tears buildings from their foundations. Within seconds of the first jolt, Japan's meteorological agency issued a tsunami advisory for the coastal waters of the Ariake Sea and the Yatsushiro Sea, warning coastal residents to move to higher ground. For a tense stretch of minutes, memories of March 2011 hung over the country like a shadow. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that killed more than 18,000 people and triggered a nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. This time, the advisory was lifted within the hour. No wall of water came ashore. But the absence of a tsunami did nothing to soften what was already unfolding on land, where the shaking itself had become the disaster. The single most devastating scene of the entire event took place inside the Aon Mall in Kashima town, a sprawling shopping complex that, on a typical weekday afternoon, might have held close to 3,000 customers browsing stores, eating at food courts, going about the small errands of daily life. When the earthquake struck, the mall's structure was thrown into violent motion. Customers were evacuated to the parking lot in the initial chaos, following standard emergency protocol, and for a moment it seemed the worst had passed. Then, just over an hour later, an explosion tore through another section of the building. Japanese broadcaster NHK reported that the blast was likely triggered by a gas leak, ignited somewhere deep within the mall's second floor, in a section that had already been weakened by the quake's shaking. The explosion caused part of the second floor to collapse entirely, trapping an unknown number of people beneath twisted steel, concrete, and debris. The mall's operator, Aon, later confirmed that approximately 2,700 staff members had been working at the location that day. In the hours following the collapse, teams combed through the wreckage, checking off names, one by one, against that staff roster, desperate to account for everyone. Aon's president, Akio Yoshida, appeared before cameras at a news conference in Kumamoto and bowed deeply alongside 2 other company executives, telling reporters that the company took seriously the fact that an explosion had occurred and that lives had been lost. It was a moment of visible corporate anguish, the kind rarely broadcast so openly, a public acknowledgement that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside a building meant to be safe. Rescue crews descended on the mall almost immediately. Soldiers from Japan's self-defense forces joined firefighters and specialized units, including members of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department's elite rescue squad, in an operation that stretched through the night and into the following day. Footage from inside and around the site showed part of the ceiling caved in, metal support beams twisted and exposed, and rescue workers in helmets and masks navigating through the rubble in painstaking, careful movements, aware that any additional disturbance could bring more of the structure down on both victims and rescuers alike. 8 people were pulled from the wreckage of the mall in the earliest hours of the search. 4 of them did not survive. As the search extended into its second day, 3 mall workers remained unaccounted for out of the nearly 2,700 staff members who had been on site, according to Aon's own internal count. Local police told Japanese broadcaster TBS that there had been, in their words, a lot of deaths inside the mall, though officials cautioned it would take time to confirm an exact figure. That kind of careful, deliberately unconfirmed language is often the clearest signal of just how serious a situation has become. Officials choosing not to speculate, because the true number is still being assembled body by body, name by name, but the mall was only one node in a much wider web of destruction. Roughly 20 kilometers away, in the city of Yatsushiro, a towering industrial chimney at a Nippon Paper Industries factory came down during the shaking, killing 5 workers outright. 7 others were pulled from the surrounding debris alive. 4 more were believed to still be trapped in the aftermath. according to the Kumamoto Prefectural Government's disaster response team. Aerial photographs released in the hours after the quake showed the damaged chimney reduced to a jagged, broken stump surrounded by twisted metal and fallen brick, a stark visual reminder that this was not a disaster confined to a single building. It was a disaster that had reached into workplaces, homes, and infrastructure across an entire prefecture simultaneously. In residential neighborhoods, scattered throughout Kumamoto Prefecture, aerial police footage captured entire homes reduced to flattened piles of timber and roofing material. In the city of Uki, a resident named Akira Motoda stood beside the collapsed concrete block wall of his own house, speaking quietly with a neighbor, one of countless small human moments unfolding across a landscape suddenly reshaped by violence beneath the surface. Some homes had not simply collapsed in place. Police footage showed a handful of structures that had slid entirely into a nearby river, swallowed by moving earth and unstable ground. At a Buddhist temple called Jofukuji in Kumamoto, the hanging bell hall collapsed, and in the aftermath, local residents could be seen quietly clearing debris from the damaged structure, an image that captured both the physical and cultural toll of the disaster. Centuries-old buildings, places of worship and memory reduced to rubble in less than a minute of shaking. The earthquake's first reported foreign casualty was a Vietnamese technical intern working at a factory in the affected region. According to the Vietnamese government, a crane fell on him during the earthquake, killing him instantly. He had arrived in Japan only in January of this year, part of a technical internship program that brings thousands of foreign workers into Japanese industries every year. 7 other Vietnamese interns at the same factory managed to evacuate safely. Separately, a Vietnamese woman married to one of the workers at the site was injured when a wall collapsed on her, and she was taken to a hospital for treatment. These details, small against the scale of the overall tragedy, are a reminder that disasters like this one do not discriminate by nationality or background. They simply strike everyone who happens to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. By the morning after the quake, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stood before reporters in Tokyo, heading an emergency task force assembled to coordinate the national disaster response. Her words were blunt and urgent. "There are people who are still waiting to be rescued," she told the assembled press, "and it is a race against time." It was a statement that captured the exact emotional register of the entire nation in that moment. Not relief that the shaking had stopped, but dread over what might still be found beneath the wreckage. Takaichi confirmed that reports were coming in of damage to roads, bridges, and buildings across the affected region, along with widespread blackouts and fires, though she cautioned that full details were still unclear as assessment teams fanned out across the disaster zone. The scale of the disruption to daily infrastructure was staggering even before final damage assessments were complete. Bullet train services across the Kyushu region were suspended entirely for safety inspections, halting one of the country's most vital transportation arteries and stranding travelers across the island. The runway at Aso Kumamoto Airport was closed, with officials stating there was, in their words, no prospect of resuming operations in the immediate term. Kumamoto Airport in the town of Mashiki suspended all flights within minutes of the quake. For a country that prides itself on the precision and reliability of its transportation networks, the sudden and total halt of trains and flights across an entire region was itself a signal of just how severe the underlying damage had been. Power and water infrastructure fared no better. Nearly 3,900 homes across the region were left without electricity in the hours following the quake, according to Kumamoto prefectural officials, while approximately 15,000 homes were cut off from running water entirely. More than 8,800 residents fled their homes altogether, seeking shelter in more than 400 emergency evacuation centers that were hastily organized across the prefecture. Local authorities scrambled to install additional power sources at these shelters, driven by an urgent need to provide air conditioning because the disaster struck during a stretch of brutally hot, sweltering summer weather, conditions that made survival in damaged homes and recovery efforts in the debris exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. That heat became its own quiet antagonist in the story. Rescue workers, many of them in full protective gear, labored through punishing temperatures as they searched for survivors, and officials repeatedly voiced concern that the sweltering conditions were compounding the risks faced by anyone still trapped beneath collapsed structures. A resident named Kiyoshi Matsunaga, 74 years old, described the moment the earthquake struck while he was at a supermarket near the mall, pushing his shopping cart toward the checkout line. He recalled the shelves emptying instantly, items scattering across the floor, and a paralyzing certainty that gripped him in that instant. The thought that he was going to die. He could not move, he said. It is testimony like this, ordinary people frozen mid-errand by violence from below, that captures what statistics alone cannot. The pure, disorienting terror of an earthquake as it happens, when the difference between survival and catastrophe is measured in feet and seconds. In the 24 hours following the initial quake, seismologists recorded roughly 190 aftershocks rattling the same region, according to the U.S. Geological Survey and the Japan Meteorological Society. Nearly 200 additional tremors, some strong enough to be felt clearly by residents already living in evacuation shelters, others subtle enough to pass almost unnoticed beneath the noise of rescue operations. For survivors already traumatized by the initial event, this relentless drumbeat of aftershocks meant there was no clean psychological line between disaster and recovery. The ground itself kept reminding them, hour after hour, that it was not yet finished moving. Seismologists monitoring the sequence in real time described a familiar but unsettling pattern. A shallow main shock of this size almost always produces a long aftershock sequence, and in the Kumamoto region specifically, that sequence carries a particular historical weight. Local geological memory has not forgotten 2016 when a moderate foreshock struck the same prefecture 2 days before a far larger, more destructive quake followed in its wake, catching residents and even some seismologists off guard. That earlier disaster taught Japanese disaster response planners a hard lesson that an initial strong earthquake cannot always be trusted to be the largest event in a sequence. It is why, this time around, officials moved so quickly to warn residents that further strong shaking remained a real possibility in the days ahead, urging people not to re-enter damaged buildings, even if those buildings appeared, at a glance, to still be standing. That warning proved more than theoretical caution. Structural engineers dispatched to Kumamoto City and the surrounding municipalities began the grim, methodical work of marking buildings with colored tags. Red for structures deemed unsafe to enter under any circumstances, yellow for those requiring further inspection, green for those cleared for re-entry. It is a system refined over decades of Japanese disaster response, born out of hard experience with quakes, just like this one. And in the days following the Kumamoto earthquake, entire blocks of residential streets found themselves marked in red. Families standing outside homes they were no longer permitted to enter, watching engineers move room to room, assessing cracks in load-bearing walls and shifted foundations. One of the most sensitive questions hanging over the entire disaster involved Japan's nuclear infrastructure. Given the country's history, the catastrophic meltdown at Fukushima following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami remains seared into national and global memory. Any earthquake of this magnitude near populated coastal regions inevitably raises the specter of nuclear risk. Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority moved quickly to address these fears directly, issuing an emergency update, stating that no abnormalities had been detected at nearby nuclear facilities, specifically naming plants in Ikata, Genkai, and the broader Satsuma region as having passed initial safety checks without incident. Separately, officials confirmed there were no abnormalities found at 3 nuclear power plants situated within range of the quake's shaking. It was, in the context of the broader disaster, one piece of unambiguously good news. A nuclear catastrophe layered atop an earthquake. Catastrophe was, at least for now, successfully avoided. Japan's Fire and Disaster Management Agency issued its own statement in the immediate aftermath, noting that there were no reports of damage to major public facilities or critical infrastructure at a national level. A statement intended to reassure the wider public, even as local. Granular reports from Kumamoto continued to paint a far grimmer picture on the ground. This is often the strange duality of disaster reporting in the first hours after an event. National agencies working from incomplete data offering cautious reassurance, while local officials and residents describe scenes of destruction that contradict that caution almost in real time. It would take days of methodical assessment for the true scale of the damage to fully emerge. At local hospitals, the human toll of the earthquake was measured out in gurneys and waiting rooms. A hospital in Yatsushiro City received approximately 40 injured patients in the hours after the quake, according to Japanese news agency Kyodo, while about 50 additional patients were transported to a hospital in Kumamoto City itself. Local officials reported that at least 62 people had been injured overall, 6 of them seriously, though these figures were understood from the outset to be preliminary, likely to rise as search and rescue operations continued to comb through the wreckage of homes, factories, and the mall itself. By the second day, the confirmed death toll had climbed to 18, according to prefectural officials cited by multiple international news agencies, up from an initial count of 13 announced by Prime Minister Takaichi the previous morning. Local media reported that 2 women in their 20s had been found dead early on the second day inside the partially collapsed shopping mall. A grim update that underscored just how much work remained even after the first wave of search efforts had concluded. Officials cautioned repeatedly that the tally was expected to continue climbing as rescue teams reached areas of the wreckage that remained, for safety reasons, still inaccessible. The rescue operation inside the Aon Mall itself became a case study in the almost unbearable patience that search and rescue work demands. Specialized teams used listening devices designed to detect faint sounds beneath rubble, a knock, a voice, the scrape of movement, while search dogs trained specifically for disaster response or walked across sections of debris too unstable for heavy machinery to approach. Engineers monitored the remaining structure continuously, watching for signs that additional sections of the mall's damaged floors might give way, a risk that forced rescue crews to halt operations more than once, so that shoring materials could be installed to stabilize collapsed sections before searchers were permitted to continue underneath them. Every hour of that caution was, in effect, a trade-off between speed and survival, moving fast enough to reach anyone who might still be alive, while moving carefully enough not to trigger a second collapse that could kill both victims and rescuers alike. News of the disaster rippled outward across the region within hours, prompting messages of condolence and offers of assistance from neighboring governments and international partners who have, over the decades, developed close cooperative relationships with Japan on disaster response. It is a grim but familiar diplomatic ritual by now. A major earthquake strikes, and within a news cycle, foreign ministries issue statements of solidarity, some offering search and rescue teams, others offering financial assistance for reconstruction, almost all of them invoking Japan's own history of resilience in the face of seismic catastrophe. For a country that sits directly atop one of the most seismically active regions on the entire planet, this cycle of disaster, response, and slow recovery has become an almost defining feature of national life, repeated with painful regularity across generations. Economic assessments of the damage, while still preliminary in the earthquake's immediate aftermath, pointed toward significant costs ahead. Beyond the human toll, officials faced the prospect of rebuilding damaged transportation infrastructure across an entire island's bullet train network, restoring a regional airport whose runway had suffered structural damage severe enough that officials publicly stated there was no near-term prospect of reopening it, compensating a paper manufacturing company whose factory chimney now lay in ruins alongside the loss of 5 of its workers. Insurance assessors and structural engineers were expected to spend weeks, if not months, cataloging the full scope of damaged property across Kumamoto Prefecture, a process that, historically, in disasters of this scale in Japan, has stretched well into the following year before final damage estimates are settled. What makes an earthquake like this one so viscerally frightening is not simply its magnitude, but its geography. Japan sits atop what geologists call the Pacific Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped arc of intense seismic and volcanic activity that stretches across Southeast Asia and around the entire rim of the Pacific Ocean basin. It is the same tectonic reality that produced the devastating 1995 Kobe earthquake, which killed roughly 6,000 people in western Japan, and the 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes, a pair of major tremors, one measuring 6. 4 in a second, more powerful quake measuring 7, 3, that together killed dozens and left the same region reeling less than a decade ago. This new earthquake, striking almost the identical geographic footprint as that 2016 disaster, forces an uncomfortable question to the surface. How many times can one region rebuild before the rebuilding itself becomes an act of quiet, exhausted defiance against geography? Kumamoto's history with seismic violence goes back further still, and the region's proximity to Mount Aso, one of the largest active volcanic calderas on Earth, adds another layer of geological tension to an already fragile landscape. Shallow crustal earthquakes like this one, quakes that occur close to the surface and directly beneath populated areas, tend to produce disproportionately severe shaking relative to their raw magnitude number, which is precisely why a 7, one event here, proved so much more devastating in human terms than a 7. One event might be if it occurred far offshore or at much greater depth. The shallow, close-range nature of the rupture is what transformed a number on a seismograph into collapsed malls, flattened homes, and industrial chimneys reduced to rubble. As international coverage of the disaster spread, aerial images became the defining visual language of the tragedy. Wide shots showing the damaged Aon Mall from above, its roofline visibly disrupted, debris scattered across what had once been an orderly parking structure. Photographs of the Nippon paper industry's chimney, once a slender industrial spire, now truncated and jagged against the sky. Ground-level images of collapsed temple gates, crumbled residential walls, and rescue workers moving in careful, coordinated formation through debris fields, searching for signs of life. These first images, circulated rapidly across news agencies and social media in the hours after the quake, did something that statistics alone could never accomplish. They made an abstract magnitude number feel immediate, physical, and human. In the days that followed, Japan's response mechanisms, honed by decades of experience with seismic disaster, moved into full operation. Self-defense forces personnel worked alongside civilian firefighters and police rescue units in a coordinated, methodical search of the affected zone. Evacuation shelters were staffed and supplied. Emergency utility crews began the slow work of restoring power to tens of thousands of homes. Transportation authorities began inspecting bridges, rail lines, and runways, section by section, working toward the eventual restoration of the region's critical infrastructure. It is a grim irony of modern Japan that the country's disaster response capacity is simultaneously a point of national pride and a repeated painful necessity, refined again and again through a history littered with exactly this kind of catastrophe. For the families of those still missing at both the mall and the factory sites, the days following the quake stretched into an agonizing vigil. Each hour brought updates from rescue crews, sometimes hopeful, sometimes devastating, as searchers worked through layers of collapsed concrete and twisted steel. The Aon Mall site, in particular, remained a focal point of both grief and determination, its damaged structure standing as a visible, unavoidable landmark of the tragedy for anyone traveling through Kashima town in the earthquake's aftermath. Executives from the company continued to appear before cameras, offering updates and apologies in equal measure, a public reckoning with the fact that an explosion inside a commercial space meant to be safe had claimed lives that should never have been at risk. As of the most recent reporting, the death toll stood at no fewer than 18 people, with officials from Kumamoto Prefecture and national government spokespeople alike cautioning that the figure remained provisional and likely to rise further as search operations continued. At least 62 people had been confirmed injured, 6 of them seriously. Thousands remained displaced, sheltering in evacuation centers across the prefecture as authorities worked to restore basic services and assess the long-term structural safety of damaged buildings, bridges, and homes. Nearly 200 aftershocks continued to ripple through the region, a persistent, unsettling reminder that the geological event responsible for so much loss had not fully finished releasing its accumulated tectonic strain. There is also, in the wake of any earthquake of this magnitude, a quieter psychological toll that rarely appears in official casualty figures, but shapes the recovery just as profoundly. Thousands of residents who did not lose their homes outright, nevertheless, found themselves unable to sleep indoors in the nights immediately following the quake, choosing instead to remain in cars, in tents, or in the open air of parking lots and parks, terrified of aftershocks bringing down ceilings that had survived the initial shaking but might not survive a second one. Child psychologists and disaster response counselors, deployed alongside physical rescue teams in past Japanese earthquakes, have consistently found that this kind of prolonged, low-grade fear, the fear of simply going back inside, can linger for months after the physical wreckage has been cleared. It is a reminder that an earthquake's true footprint extends well past the boundaries of collapsed buildings and cracked roads, reaching into the nervous systems of everyone who lived through even a single violent minute of shaking. Comparisons to the 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes were inevitably drawn almost immediately by both Japanese media and international observers, and for good reason. That earlier disaster, a 4-shock main shock sequence that killed dozens of people and displaced tens of thousands more, remains a defining reference point for how this region understands seismic risk. Engineers who worked on post-2016 reconstruction projects noted, in the earthquake's immediate aftermath, that many structures rebuilt or reinforced after that earlier disaster appeared to have withstood this new quake's shaking far better than older, unreinforced buildings nearby. A small but meaningful validation of the expensive, sometimes politically unpopular investment Japan has made in seismic retrofitting over the past decade. It does not undo the tragedy of a collapsed mall ceiling or a fallen factory chimney, but it does suggest that the lessons of the last disaster were not entirely forgotten, even if they were not enough to prevent this one. What remains, in the wake of the initial shock and the flood of first images from the disaster zone, is the slow, unglamorous work of recovery, rebuilding homes that collapsed into rivers, restarting a paper factory whose chimney now lies in pieces, reopening a shopping mall whose second floor caved in beneath an explosion no one saw coming. It is the kind of recovery that rarely makes for dramatic headlines weeks and months down the line, even though it is, in every practical sense, the truest measure of how a country survives disaster. Not simply in the hours immediately following catastrophe, but in the long, patient months of rebuilding that follow, largely unseen, long after the world's attention has moved on to the next headline. For now, the images remain raw. A collapsed mall ceiling, a broken chimney against a pale sky, a Temple Bell Hall reduced to splinters and dust, a prime minister standing before cameras describing a race against time, a death toll climbing day by day as searchers reach places they could not reach before. It is, in every sense, still an unfolding story, one whose final chapter in terms of lives lost, homes rebuilt, and lessons absorbed by a nation intimately familiar with the violence beneath its own soil has not yet been written.